ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. This is the show where we take a look at every classic Doctor Who story, plus a bunch of big finish audio dramas, one episode a day, 7 days a week. And today, on the 14th of October 2019, we're starting a look at the final story in the E-Space Trilogy, and the final story to feature both Romana and K9, with Warrior's Gate, starting with Part 1. Warrior's Gate is actually, he brings in another new writer for season 18, this time Stephen Gallagher, who I believe has written for other TV shows, he's kind of a big name, I guess. I don't know. I genuinely can't, I can't really tell. I've had difficulty finding some information on the man. He does seem to have at least some credits writing in the past. But there just isn't much information out there for me to find. But Warrior's Gate is, as a story, it's a story that I am not entirely sure how I feel about it, about this first episode. The episode is, clearly, it's only the first episode, so it's not like this is definitely like good or bad, or I can't really label it as, as a good or bad story right off the bat. But it's an odd start. The story was directed by by a man called Paul Joyce, I believe, in what is his only, basically the only story. This is the only story he directed. This is the only doctor. He only directed this story. That's it. And what's interesting is that he starts off the story with just not one establishing shot, but several establishing shots that go on for about 2 minutes. Which is something that I think is just weird. Like, really, it's not that this style of direction, isn't necessarily a good style of direction for a Doctor Who story. It's kind of slow. It's kind of a slow moving sort of tone. It's just like the shots are very, it's a very deliberate. It's basically as we travel through this spaceship, and this spaceship is in E-space, and it's like, the implication, I guess, is that it's time traveling, and there's this lion creature called Byrok that is the navigator, and it's like he's sort of there against his will, which is I think this is a story trying to be like a Doctor Who does and takes a stand. He basically takes a stand against slavery, I guess, but it's, there's not a lot of explanation as to who these people are. Like, they're traveling through time, Byrok escapes, and basically flows through, like, the time winds, whereas the TARDIS also crashes into the time winds. Like, they crash into each other. Like, there's this potential, I think the idea is that, like, almost like, sort of the old-fashioned, they jumped a time track. which is, I mean, okay, it's not necessarily a bad. I'm not gonna say this is a bad start to the story. Um, it's just it it isn't really a start. Very little happens. Like the Doctor, Romana, and Adric stay in the TARDIS, where Byrok comes in, says stuff about the past is my present and your future, and then leave. And then don't others are coming. Don't trust them. Um, and then the Doctor goes out into the White Void. Mind you, I'm going to talk about the White Void. It's a green screen. This is a story where a lot of the sets are just a green screen. Which I mean, it's not as bad. There isn't as much fraying as, say, Underworld, when that story was entirely green screened in. But it's still enough that you realize, oh, this is just a green screen. There's really nothing to like. There's nothing special to it. It's a green screening white. When like, but it's kind of sad when you have like a white background and an endless representing a void, and they don't just do what they did in the Mind Robber and use the empty studio like the white studio. That would have looked just a lot better. It worked for the Mind Robber. It would work here. It's one of those things where I just complain about. But like, yeah, there isn't much here. There's some decent moments of comedy between the Doctor, Adric, and Romana. The Doctor says, "Why don't we just press random buttons?" And it's like he's like, that's actually not a bad idea. So the Doctor goes to press a button. Romana stops and is like, that's the reverse thrusters or something. And it's like, basically he could have killed everyone. But it's not quite this. But and then Adric then just presses a button, which I guess causes the doors to like a full materialization to occur. That's funny, but other than that, there isn't much in this story for like any sort of plot or character development. It's just sort of, this episode really doesn't do much. Like, it's I guess I enjoyed it. I'm intrigued. There's enough mystery here, but the problem here is we're at the end of episode 1, so maybe we should have gotten a little more explanation into what's actually going on, with the story, and not just like, oh, here's a mystery, here's a lion person, and here are some slavers traveling through time for some reason. We don't even know really why they're traveling through time. It doesn't get done. It doesn't get explained in this episode at all. I mean, again, the Doctor doesn't actually meet any of them either, so it's really, this is just a really weird episode just to watch. So overall, I'm going to give Warriors Gate Part 1 a 5 out of 10. Alright, it is the 15th of October 2019, and I just finished watching Part 2 of Warriors Gate. Now, with Part 2 of Warriors Gate, I am not entirely sure what to think about this story. And what I mean by that is that, as a story, Stephen Gallagher doesn't seem to have a solid grounding of, here is what my story is. This is its plot, these are its characters, this is what the story's doing. This is what we are. It's not really necessarily a story where you you get it's not a story where it seems like there's kind of just almost like I don't want to say a dry spell of information, but it feels almost like it is like the information of, what's going on with this plot is almost intentionally kind of dried up. It's not like here's concrete plot point 1 to plot point 2 to plot point 3 to plot point 4. It's almost feels kind of like Gallagher's trying to play around with emotions. We see the actual gate of the title in this episode, even though it doesn't do much. Like, the Doctor spends much of this wandering around this castle, where there are these Gundams. They're like robots, in suits of armor, no relation to sort of the anime Gundam, and they basically the Doctor basically rigs one of them up to sort of exposit some stuff. And it's not a very sort of solid premise when you think about it, because it's like, okay, like, this is just an episode full of exposition, which is just without actually expositing any sort of real information about, here's the story, here's the plot, here is, what you should be invested in for this story. Here's why you should be invested. It's just sort of here's some stuff, take it or leave it. I'm gonna let you feel for it. It's a very weird way of going about a story like this. Like really, you're not. It's not like they're being like, here's a full length story. Here's some fun characters. Like, the Doctor doesn't actually do much. He just wanders around the castle. Well, Romana is actually the one doing stuff. She steps out of the TARDIS, right into the traitor's hands, and the traitors basically, they're basically like, they take her to her ship. Adric stays in the TARDIS and then follows after her as Romana walks away. I guess because he wants to make sure she's okay with K9, who has been totally destroyed. His efficiency is less than 0%, so he's more than just useless. He's an active hindrance at this point. You either get the feeling, and it's been actually a theme through season 18, that you get this feeling that John Nathan Turner, who's kind of in charge because he's the producer, doesn't really like K9, because K9's just been sort of relegated to this background role of, I'm in the background here, hello, and not really given a foreground, a foreground for a role. Just he's just sort of relegated to being in the background and not given really anything to do. Like, he's just sort of, it's like he's there, it's K9, everyone loves K9. Romana's portions of the episode are perhaps the most interesting, because you have some explanation that the ship is powered by time sensitives, and Birak is he's a Theral, which was a type of time sensitive, I guess native to E-Space, but he left because and it's like they're also they have cargo that's other time sensitive, so they end up trying to use Romana as a navigator, which causes her physical pain, but it works. And Romana is basically used against her will, which is kind of a, let's be honest, kind of a dark narrative. This story does have a bit of a dark narrative if you have the idea that it's about slavery. But as an episode, a lot of its problems come in the fact that just not a lot really happens. Like, a lot happens with nothing happening, which seems like a paradox. But in a story like this, you get the sense that maybe maybe something was cut out, or maybe somehow something was meant to be a little more fleshed out here, a little more fleshed out there, and wasn't. Because as it stands, this is an episode where there isn't a lot here to enjoy. It's not really a good episode. It's an episode that's there. It's sort of a take it or leave it. And if it weren't, and honestly, by this point, if I were watching this live, I probably would have switched off, because it's not an interesting enough story to keep me moving forward. I mean, there's a definite downturn in quality, as like some of the answers get revealed for the whole mystery, and they're not actually satisfying. Like, why did this have to be a mystery? Why couldn't we have just started this and maybe moved on faster, and moved on with a little more interest, so to speak, with what this story is. Because other than that, it's an episode that exists. That's what I can say. So I'm going to give Warriors Gate Part 2 a 3 out of 10. Alright, it's the 15th of October 2019, and I just finished watching Part 3 of Warriors Gate, which is the worst episode yet! Yay! This isn't really anything to celebrate. This story is going off the rails rather rapidly, going right down into just weird territory. I think weird territory sums it up. The story feels almost like it wants to be artistic. An example of art and something or other. I don't know. It's not really explained. It's just sort of like, oh, we have art. Let us do our art, because that's what this story does. It's a story about people doing things and stuff. It's not really like here's a really big, amazing story that we just had to tell. Or else the world would be missing out on my amazing plot. Stephen Gallagher, he writes a story where the message is basically, don't keep slaves, because eventually you'll become the slaves. Ooh, terrifying, I guess. Like, that's one of the big quote-unquote reveals here, is that the Therals were once slavers, but now they have become the enslaved, which is, I guess you could say it's fine for a story. It's not, that necessarily that bad. But it is something where, you could get, like, you could perhaps have done things a little more interesting, done maybe something a little more fun with that, not necessarily done like an entire story of just characters kind of being in rooms, and being in rooms, they just sort of do stuff. They don't really go anywhere with much of these ideas. They just kind of leave it at that. It's something where you kind of get the feeling that maybe there was meant to be something a bit more deep when it comes to this story. it's not really a um a story that does a um that does a full length um it doesn't really do like a full story. It's just kind of, hey, here's here's kind of a plot. uh so uh so here's something where we maybe could have had uh an interesting maybe something interesting to do with the story, but there just really wasn't there really wasn't anything that all that interesting in the um it's just sort of like, here's kind of our idea. um it's 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 a really kind of odd way of doing a story, in that um it's not really well executed, and it at all. It's just kind of a story that's there, um, and in being a story that's there, it doesn't really fall under any big circumstances. It's just sort of a story that it's like, hey, we had this kind of an idea here, so here's what here's sort of what we've come to for a story. There's a lot of stuff with like other time tracks, and a lot of the stuff with the slavers is forgettable. They aren't interesting villains at all. Just they're just sort of there. Uh, they aren't like a big solid, here's here's our villain, here's really what we're trying to do. It's just sort of we maybe had an idea for a potential villain, but that we didn't really do much with that. So uh have kind of not really a fake out, but kind of just a bog standard villain, and maybe we'll have some interesting stuff to do with this story. There really isn't much here that the story does that other stories haven't done better and in a more interesting way. It's just kind of bland the way that it is, and it just doesn't build up to anything. It's like there might have been perhaps a good idea here at some point, but it's just no longer there. So overall, I'm going to give Warriors Gate Part 3 a 2 out of 10. Alright, it is the 16th of October 2019, and I just finished watching Part 4 of Warriors Gate, finishing the story. And I have to say, I didn't particularly. This story just sort of ends with the villains being defeated and an outcry of, you're being monstrous, which, not necessarily the worst. Actually, this is kind of just a bad ending. Um, the idea is that the idea is that the story kind of ends. Um, the story. The story just sort of ends with Romana deciding, I'm gonna help lead the Feral out of enslavement, and we're gonna go on a crusade through E-Space. So this is Romana's last story, and it's not at all satisfying. It's not a satisfying exit. I think of all of the Doctor Who companions, only Sarah, for the fourth Doctor, only Sarah Jane and Anne Kelso had satisfying exits. Um, um, uh, and and as a as a story, it's not the most it's not that great. It's a story where the message is there, and it could be, a decent potential. There's maybe some decent ideas here, but as a story, uh, this this isn't this isn't uh, really a good story for any companion to leave on, or a good way to end an arc. It's all essentially substance over. It's also all style over substance. There isn't really any substance here, except some very artistic shots, and some shots that would be impressive if they were pulled off, but a lot of them actually aren't pulled off very well, because they're like, oh, we're doing this on a BBC budget, not like an actual decent sized budget. It's literally, here we have the BBC, and with the BBC we can get some maybe some money put into shots, but the direction here, it falls flat. It's kind of overly ambitious. Um, it's not a very solid um, um, it's not a very solid way of doing the story. It's just sort of there to be there. Um, you know, it's it's not an it's a story that isn't interested in it isn't interested in really telling a plot. It's almost like we have a message, and we took kind of a little bit of plot and tried to warp it around. It's it's not perhaps it's just it's a bad episode. It's an episode that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and doesn't really work to be work in this context, or just any context, as a conclusion to an arc. Yeah, that I guess you could say there's maybe uh, maybe some ideas. Overall, Warriors Gate Part 4 just isn't good. This isn't a good episode I would skip it if it weren't for the fact that Romana leaves in it. I'd give part 4 a 2 out of 10. That being said, this is the end of the story, so we add up the scores and average them out to give Warriors Gate a final score of 3 out of 10. Thank you everybody for watching this installment of the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. As always, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. And join me next time when we are at the penultimate story for Tom Baker's Doctor with the Keeper of TRAKEN.